So in no particular order, start with tip number one. First and foremostly, I think it's important as a fire risk assessor that we understand our roles and responsibilities. Absolutely essential that we recognise what it is we're doing and why it is we're doing it. But if we think about responsibility, we all recognise, I'm sure, that through the various pieces of legislation that exist across the UK, there are a number of different ways of referring to responsibility, and I'm going to focus on the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, the RRO in England and Wales in terms of responsibility anyway, but where we might call somebody a responsible person here, in Scotland they're called a duty holder, in Northern Ireland an appropriate person, and in Ireland responsible person could be the employer or a landlord. But in real terms, their roles and responsibilities are pretty much the same. So the RRO says, in terms of what is the meaning of a responsible person, it says in relation to a workplace, it's the employer, if that workplace is to an extent under their control, and if it's not a workplace, it's somebody who has control over the premises, or the owner, where the person in control of the premises does not have control. So a little bit confusing maybe, but I think the thing that we probably we most need to understand is that when it comes to responsibility, it's not just that responsible person that carries the can. The regulations go on to say that any duty imposed on the responsible person can also be imposed on every person who has to any extent control of those premises, but only as far as they relate to those areas that he has control of. So let's say, for example, somebody's responsible for maintaining the fire detection and alarm system, then that's the extent of their control. They're clearly not responsible for whether the emergency lighting functions or whether they have an evacuation plan for the premises, but they will be responsible for those elements they have control over. And it goes on to say, where you have a contract or tenancy or any obligation in relation to the maintenance or repair of the premises or the safety of any premises, then you can be treated as a person who has control to the extent that that obligation extends. And that clearly draws in the fire risk assessor. So under duties, the legislation says the responsible person must make a suitable and sufficient assessment. Interestingly, it doesn't say that they can get somebody else in to do it for them, but that's as we've clearly come to understand the requirement, that it won't always be the responsible person doing the risk assessment themselves, but they can draw other people in to help them deal with it. And that's really where our role as fire risk assessors comes into play. But what we also have to recognise, I suppose, in terms of what we've just been looking at from a roles and responsibilities perspective, is that as an assessor, we can be prosecuted if we don't get things right. This is just an example, a recent example, a piece in the FPA's journal Fire and Risk Management about Wakefield Grammar School, where their former fire risk assessor, Dr. Gibson, was prosecuted on the basis that they hadn't produced a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment, and they found a number of problems around the school that really shouldn't have been there. So our role is one of providing support to the responsible person, but we also have to understand that because we have a degree of control over what goes on, we can be held accountable for what we do and what we say. And that's why it's absolutely essential that we get things right from top to bottom. So what does a fire risk assessment look like? Well, wouldn't it be nice if somebody told us that directly? Well, here's just an example, probably one that we wouldn't necessarily want to repeat, but you can see here's a letter to London Fire Brigade that says, "Dear Sir, I've inspected the building from top to bottom and there is no fire risk on the premises." Well, I think we'd all be slightly incredulous at reading that, and as will London Fire Brigade, and they sent some people down to have a look, and these were some of the circumstances they found when they got there. So somebody thinks, or is either trying to pull the wool over people's eyes to the fact that they've done a fire risk assessment, albeit they clearly hadn't done it effectively, or maybe they just didn't understand. Who knows? But that clearly is not going to that's not going to meet the requirements in terms of suitable and sufficient by a very long shot. So what we need to be aware of is that first and foremostly, our role is one, to support the responsible person, because the responsible person has to make sure that their fire risk assessment is suitable and sufficient. But at the same time, we also have to recognise that because as risk assessors, we have a degree of control, we can be held accountable if we don't do things properly.